She didn't have money for a lawyer, so her granddaughter had a brilliant idea. Dorothy Wilson felt tears streaming down her face as she listened to the judge's words echoing through the courtroom. 3 years of imprisonment for tax fraud involving her small craft store. At 68 years old, she had been accused of evading taxes she never knew she owed, the result of poor bookkeeping by a dishonest accountant who vanished with her documents. Little Emily, just 10 years old, watched everything from the courtroom gallery. Her heart ached as she saw the grandmother who had raised her since infancy handcuffed and led away by the guards. The girl couldn't understand how this was happening. Her grandmother Dorothy had always been the most honest person she knew. "Grandma, I'll get you out of there," Emily whispered as she watched Dorothy disappear down the courthouse hallway. The girl had lost her parents in a car accident when she was just 2 years old. Since then, Dorothy had raised her alone, working day and night in her small embroidery and craft shop in downtown Cleveland. It was a modest store, but it supported them both with dignity. Everything began when Dorothy hired Richard Slater, an accountant who presented himself as a small business specialist. He promised to organize all the tax matters for the shop and handle every payment. Dorothy, who had little education and no understanding of computers, trusted him completely. For months, Richard took care of everything. Dorothy simply signed the papers he brought, believing everything was in order. What she didn't know was that he was falsifying records, creating fake debts, and pocketing the money she paid for taxes. When the tax audit arrived at the shop, Dorothy discovered she owed an astronomical sum to the government. Richard had disappeared, taking all the original documents and leaving only the forged ones as evidence against her. With no money to hire a private lawyer, Dorothy had to accept a public defender. The attorney was overwhelmed with dozens of cases and barely had time to review her situation. During the trial, he couldn't prove Dorothy's innocence, and she was ultimately convicted. Emily returned home that night with a broken heart. The house felt empty without the sounds of her grandmother cooking dinner or sewing in the living room. The girl barely slept, thinking of how she could help. The next morning, instead of going straight to school, Emily made a decision. She took the bus to the public library. There, she asked the librarian, Ms. Catherine, to help her find books about law. "Sweetheart, you're too young for this," Ms. Catherine said, puzzled by the request. "Please, it's to help my grandma." "She was unfairly arrested," Emily explained with tears in her eyes. Ms. Catherine, moved by the situation, decided to help. She brought out some simpler law books and began explaining basic concepts to the girl. Emily absorbed everything like a sponge, taking notes in an old notebook. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us as we're just starting out. Now back to the story. Every day after school, Emily rushed to the library. She studied tax law, fraud, and legal procedures. Miss Catherine was amazed by the girl's dedication and began setting aside special materials for her. "Emily, you know this is really difficult, right?" Miss Catherine said one day. "Even adults with law degrees struggle with these subjects." "I know, Miss Catherine, but I can't give up on my grandma," Emily replied with determination. During weekly visits to the prison, Emily shared everything she was learning with Dorothy. Her grandmother listened lovingly, though deep down she thought her granddaughter was just dreaming. "My dear granddaughter, you're very smart, but these things are too complicated," Dorothy would say, stroking the girl's face through the bars. "Grandma, I'll find a way. Mr. Richard did something wrong and I'll prove it," Emily insisted. Dorothy smiled sadly. She didn't want to crush her granddaughter's hopes, but she knew the chances were slim. Truthfully, she was more worried about Emily's future. Who would take care of the girl now? At home, Emily stayed with their neighbor, Ms. Rose, a kind woman who offered to look after her temporarily. But Emily missed her grandmother every day. Their house remained closed, with the shop sealed by court order. One day, while watching TV at Ms. Rose's house, Emily saw a local program called Justice for All, a show where lawyers gave free legal advice live to callers. "Ms. Rose, can I use your phone?" Emily asked excitedly. "Of course, dear. But what for?" "I'm calling that show. They can help my grandma." Emily called several times, but the line was always busy. When she finally got through, she barely started explaining before being cut off. "Sorry, sweetheart, but this show is for adults. the operator said before hanging up. Emily didn't give up. She called again the next day, this time deepening her voice to sound older. She made it past screening and got on air. "Hi, my name is, Emily Wilson. My grandma was convicted of tax fraud, but she's innocent," she said nervously, trying to sound mature. "How old are you?" asked the host, Henry Baker, skeptically. Emily hesitated, then admitted. 10. "Listen, kid, this isn't a game. Let's take the next caller," Henry said, disconnecting. Emily was devastated but kept trying, always getting cut off when they realized her age. Until one day, the show's producer, Patricia Davis, answered directly. "Please don't hang up," Emily begged. "I know I'm a kid, but my grandma needs help. She raised me alone and now she's in jail because of a crooked accountant." Patricia was moved by the girl's determination. She decided to look into the case herself without telling Henry. "All right, Emily, tell me the whole story slowly," Patricia said, grabbing paper and pen. Emily shared everything she knew about her grandmother's case. Patricia was intrigued by some details the girl mentioned and arranged to meet Emily at the library to talk further. On the day of the meeting, Patricia found Emily surrounded by law books. The sight touched her deeply. A 10-year-old studying complex legal texts to save her grandmother. "Emily, do you have any documents about your grandma's case?" Patricia asked. "Just a few things I managed to save before they locked up the house," Emily replied, showing a folder with sparse papers. Patricia examined them. Though not a lawyer, she'd worked with legal issues for years on the show. Certain details stood out. "Emily, did you notice this signature looks different from this one?" Patricia pointed out, comparing two documents. "No? What does that mean?" "It might mean someone forged your grandma's signature on some papers." Emily's eyes lit up. Finally, someone was taking her suspicions seriously. Patricia promised to investigate further and possibly feature the case on the show. Meanwhile, Emily tried another approach. She asked Ms. Catherine for help creating a social media page about her grandmother's story. Ms. Catherine, whose daughter understood these things, helped Emily write the first post. "My grandma, Dorothy Wilson, 68, is in jail unfairly. She's always been honest and hardworking. A dishonest accountant stole from her, and now she's paying for crimes she didn't commit. Please help me share this story." At first, the page only received criticism. Many people commented that criminals should pay for what they've done. Emily cried reading the comments, but she didn't give up. She kept posting, now with old photos of her grandmother's shop and testimonials from customers who loved Dorothy. Slowly, some people began to sympathize with her story. One day, while scrolling through the comments, Emily noticed something that caught her attention. A man named Professor Robert Thompson had written, "Young lady, I read your story and recognize clear signs of procedural error. If you'd like, I can take a look at the documents." Emily was thrilled. She replied immediately, explaining the whole situation. Professor Robert was a retired law professor from Cleveland State University. He had worked for decades on fraud cases and recognized several red flags in Emily's story. He arranged to meet the girl at the library. When he arrived and saw Emily surrounded by law books, he was impressed. "You really read all this?" he asked, picking up one of the books. "I did, Professor, and I wrote down everything I thought was important." Emily showed him her notebook full of notes. Professor Robert examined the few documents Emily had managed to keep. His decades of experience allowed him to spot the irregularities right away. "Emily, look at this," he said, pointing to a signature. "This was clearly forged. See how different it is from this other one your grandmother signed in front of you." "I knew it," Emily exclaimed. "Mr. Richard forged Grandma's signature." "It seems so. But to prove this in court, we'd need a handwriting analysis, and that's expensive." Emily's spirits sank a little, but Professor Robert continued, "But there are other ways to investigate. We need more evidence. Do you have any idea where your grandmother kept other documents?" "There was a filing cabinet in the shop, but everything's sealed now, but..." Emily paused, thinking. "Mr. Martin from the stationery store next door always helped my grandma with some things. Maybe he has something." Professor Robert thought it was a good lead. He went with Emily to the street where Dorothy's shop had been. The place was indeed sealed, but the stationery store next door was still open. Mr. Martin, a man in his 60s who had known Dorothy for over a decade, was moved to see Emily. "How are you, sweetheart? I miss your grandmother so much," he said, hugging the girl. Emily explained the situation and asked if he had kept any of her grandmother's documents. Mr. Martin thought for a moment. "You know, Emily, your grandmother sometimes came here to use my computer and printer when hers wasn't working. Maybe I have some files saved." They searched Mr. Martin's computer and found some spreadsheets Dorothy had made, trying to organize the shop's finances herself. The dates showed she had been trying to fix the tax situation months before Richard disappeared. "This is important, Emily," said Professor Robert. "It shows your grandmother was concerned about the tax issues and trying to resolve them." But Mr. Martin had more information. "You know, Emily, your grandmother wasn't the only one. That accountant did the same thing to at least 3 other shop owners around here. Ms. Mary from the bakery, Mr. John from the bike shop, and Miss Caroline from the flower shop. They all had problems after he vanished." This revelation struck Emily and Professor Robert like lightning. If Richard had done this to other shop owners, it could establish a pattern to help prove Dorothy's innocence. "Mr. Martin, could you introduce us to these people?" asked Professor Robert. "Of course, they're going through hard times too. Ms. Mary even had to close her bakery temporarily." In the following days, Emily and Professor Robert spoke with all the merchants mentioned by Mr. Martin. Each one told a similar story. Richard would introduce himself as an expert, gain their trust, take over all their tax matters, and then disappear, leaving them with enormous debts. "It's a clear pattern," said Professor Robert. "Richard was a con artist who specialized in scamming elderly shop owners." Emily was excited about their discoveries, but her joy didn't last long. During a visit to her grandmother in prison, Dorothy suddenly fell ill and fainted. She was taken to the infirmary where doctors discovered her blood pressure was dangerously high due to stress. "Grandma, you have to stay strong," Emily said, holding Dorothy's hand in the infirmary. "I'm uncovering important things to help you. My dear, you've already done so much for me. Now you need to focus on your life, on your studies," Dorothy replied weakly. "I'll never give up on you, Grandma. Professor Robert is helping me. We're going to prove you're innocent." That night, Emily was desperate. Emily, seeing her grandmother so frail in the prison infirmary, left her deeply worried. She decided to call the Justice for All program again. This time, it was Patricia, the producer, who answered. "Patricia, it's me, Emily. My grandmother got sick in prison. She's really ill. Please, can you help me?" The girl begged through tears. Patricia had looked into the case on her own and was stunned by what she'd found. Emily's determination and the evidence she'd gathered with Professor Robert were truly compelling. "Emily, we've investigated your story, you're right. We're going to do a special feature on your grandmother's case," Patricia decided. "Really? You'll help me?" Emily asked, hardly believing what she was hearing. "Yes, but I need you and Professor Robert to come to the station. We'll record everything properly." The following week, Emily and Professor Robert went to the TV station. Emily was nervous but determined. This could be the chance she'd been waiting for. The show's team was impressed by Emily's maturity and all the evidence she'd gathered. Dr. Henry Baker, the host who had hung up on her multiple times, apologized. "Emily, I'm so sorry for not listening to you before. You're an extraordinary young woman," he said, clearly moved. The segment aired on a Thursday night. The show covered the whole story: Dorothy's wrongful conviction, Emily's tireless dedication, the evidence uncovered by Professor Robert, and Richard's pattern of crimes. The response was immediate. The next day, the station's phone wouldn't stop ringing. People from all over the country called offering help. Lawyers volunteered to take the case pro bono. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us as we're just starting out. Now, back to the story. Among those who called was Davis & Associates, one of the most prestigious law firms in New York City, specializing in complex cases. The senior partner, Ms. Fiona Davis, offered to take the case pro bono. "Emily, we're going to help your grandmother," Ms. Fiona said during a phone call. "But you need to be prepared. It's going to be a long and difficult process. I'm ready, ma'am. I've studied hard and I'll keep studying, Emily replied with conviction. Miss Fiona was amazed by the legal knowledge Emily had acquired on her own. In just a few months, the girl had learned concepts that many law students take years to master. The legal team began working on the case immediately. They submitted a petition to reopen the case based on the new evidence discovered by Emily and Professor Robert. But the path wouldn't be easy. The judge who had initially convicted Dorothy didn't want to revisit his decision. He argued there weren't sufficient grounds to reopen the case. "What do we do now?" asked Emily, disheartened after hearing the denial. "We don't give up," replied Miss Fiona. "We'll dig deeper. There's something off about this whole story." The law firm's investigative team began researching Judge Richard Miller, who had convicted Dorothy. What they uncovered was shocking. Richard Slater, the missing accountant, had been the best man at the wedding of Judge Richard Miller's son years ago. They had been personal friends for decades. "This is a clear conflict of interest," Ms. Fiona explained to Emily. "The judge should never have presided over your grandmother's case, knowing he had personal ties to the man accused of defrauding her." "Does that mean Grandma's trial didn't count?" Emily asked hopefully. "It means we have grounds to request the entire case be annulled and restarted with a different judge." The discovery completely shifted the course of the case. The firm filed a motion to disqualify Judge Richard Miller, presenting all the evidence of his connections to Richard. The case gained even more attention. Newspapers across the country began covering the story of the 10-year-old girl who uncovered irregularities in her grandmother's conviction. Emily started receiving letters of support from people all over the United States. Many were from other children inspired by her fight. Others were from adults who had faced similar injustices. One letter in particular caught Emily's attention. It was from a woman named Sandra Johnson, who identified herself as Richard Slater's former secretary. "Emily, I saw your story on TV and was deeply moved. I worked for Richard for 2 years and know things that could help your grandmother. I've been afraid to speak up, but seeing your courage, I've decided to come forward." Emily showed the letter to Ms. Fiona, who immediately contacted Sandra. What she revealed was even more shocking than they imagined. Sandra explained that Richard had run an organized fraud scheme. He systematically targeted elderly small business owners, especially those with little education or technological knowledge. He convinced them to sign blank documents, which he later filled out with false information. He said it was more practical that way, that they didn't need to worry about bureaucratic details, Sandra testified. "I tried to warn them a few times, but he threatened to fire me." Most importantly, Sandra had kept copies of incriminating documents. Out of fear of retaliation, she had hidden them for years, but now she was ready to hand them over to the court. "Why did you decide to speak up now?" Emily asked during their meeting. "Because you gave me courage, sweetheart. I saw a 10-year-old fighting for her grandmother and felt ashamed for staying silent so long. The documents Sandra provided were the definitive proof they needed. There were detailed spreadsheets of Richard's schemes, including a list of all his victims. Dorothy's name was there, alongside dozens of other business owners. Even more damning were the secretly recorded phone calls Sandra had made, where Richard admitted to his frauds and even laughed about the gullible victims who fell for his scams. "With this, there's no denying your grandmother's innocence," said Ms. Fiona, reviewing the material. The case was officially reopened and reassigned to another judge, Judge Charles Allen Smith, known for his impartiality and technical rigor. The hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks later. Emily was anxious but also hopeful. Throughout this entire period, she had continued visiting her grandmother regularly. Dorothy was physically frailer, but emotionally stronger, seeing all the mobilization in her favor. "Sweetie, I can't believe everything you've managed to do," Dorothy said during one visit. "You're my hero." "Grandma, I just did what had to be done. You always taught me to fight for what's right." On the day of the hearing, the courtroom was packed. The press, curious onlookers, Emily's supporters, and representatives from human rights organizations were all present. Emily was nervous but didn't let it shake her. Judge Charles Allen carefully examined all the evidence presented. Sandra's recordings were played in court, causing a stir when Richard was heard mocking his victims. "Emily Wilson," called the judge, "I'd like you to tell the court how you uncovered all these irregularities." Emily stood up, took a deep breath, and began to speak. With remarkable maturity for her 10 years, she recounted her entire journey, from her early days in the library to her most recent discoveries. "Your Honor, my grandmother has always been an honest person. She raised me after my parents had the accident. She never stole a single cent from anyone. When I saw her being wrongfully convicted, I knew I had to do something," Emily said, her voice steady but emotional. "And what motivated you to study law, a subject so complex for your age?" asked the judge. "The certainty that my grandmother was innocent. I knew if I studied hard enough, I'd find a way to prove it." Emily's testimony moved the entire room. Several spectators were brought to tears, including some seasoned lawyers who had never seen such determination in someone so young. When it came time for the forensic report on the signatures, the results were conclusive. All signatures attributed to Dorothy on the fraudulent documents were fake. The analysis proved it was impossible for her to have signed those papers. Additionally, a new review of Dorothy's financial situation showed she was digitally illiterate and could never have created the sophisticated, fraudulent spreadsheets under her name. "It's evident that Ms. Dorothy Wilson was the victim of an elaborate criminal scheme," declared Judge Charles Allen. "All the evidence points to her complete innocence." The prosecutor, DA Robert Ford, who had been responsible for the original charges, stood up, visibly embarrassed. "Your Honor, in light of the new evidence presented, the prosecution revises its position and requests the full acquittal of the defendant, Dorothy Wilson." A murmur of relief swept through the courtroom. Emily felt tears streaming down her face, but now they were tears of joy. "After reviewing all the evidence presented," announced Judge Charles Allen, "I declare the defendant Dorothy Wilson acquitted of all charges. I order her immediate release and a review of all cases involving accountant Richard Slater." The room erupted in applause. Emily ran to her grandmother, who was having her handcuffs removed by the guards. Their embrace was captured by dozens of cameras and became a national symbol of justice and perseverance. "Grandma, we did it!" Emily cried in Dorothy's arms. "My sweet girl, you saved me," Dorothy replied, also crying with emotion. The scene was broadcast live on television and went viral on social media. Within hours, the video of the grandmother and granddaughter embracing had been seen by millions. But the victory came at a cost. Dorothy had spent 8 months in prison, time she could never get back. Her health had been weakened by stress and age. Her shop had remained closed all that time, losing customers and income. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now, continuing. In the days following the acquittal, Emily and Dorothy were welcomed as heroes in Cleveland. The local community rallied to help reopen the shop. Mr. Martin from the stationery store organized a fundraiser to buy new crafting supplies. Miss Rose, the neighbor who had cared for Emily throughout this ordeal, continued to help with everything they needed. She had practically become a second grandmother to the girl. "Emily, you're an inspiration to all of us," said Ms. Rose. "I've never seen so much determination in someone so young." Emily's story began inspiring broader changes. State Representative Frank Lewis proposed a bill to protect elderly shop owners from accounting fraud. "Emily and Dorothy's story revealed a serious flaw in our system," Rep. Lewis said during an interview. "We need to create safeguards to protect the most vulnerable." Emily was invited to speak at the Legislative Assembly about the importance of basic legal education and protecting the elderly. Her speech moved the lawmakers present. "Honorable representatives," said Emily, now 11 years old, at the Assembly podium. "My grandmother almost paid with years of her life for a crime she didn't commit. How many others are going through the same thing?" Her eloquence and maturity impressed even the most seasoned politicians. The bill passed unanimously and became known as Emily's Law in her honor. Davis and Associates, impressed by Emily's intelligence and determination, established a scholarship in her name. It would support young people interested in social justice and protecting seniors' rights. "Emily, when you grow up, you'll be an extraordinary lawyer," said Miss Fiona during the scholarship ceremony. "You've already done more for justice at 11 than many do in a lifetime." Dorothy, gradually recovering, managed to reopen her shop with the community's help. On reopening day, a long line formed outside, filled with longtime customers, neighbors, and people who had followed the story on TV, all eager to support her. "Ms. Dorothy, we never doubted you," said Miss Mary, a longtime customer. "We knew you were innocent." Dorothy was moved by each customer who walked in. Her shop, once just a means of survival, had now become a symbol of resilience and justice. Emily continued her studies as usual, but was now nationally recognized. She received invitations to speak at schools, universities, and human rights events. "Never stop fighting for what's right," Emily would say in her talks. "If a 10-year-old girl could take on the justice system, you can make a difference too." Her story was turned into a book by a journalist who had followed the case. The royalties were donated to organizations helping elderly fraud victims. The case also inspired changes in the justice system. A special protocol was created for cases involving seniors and potential fraud, ensuring they receive proper legal defense and that all possibilities of victimization are investigated. Professor Robert, who had been instrumental in uncovering the first evidence, began volunteering to provide free legal consultations for seniors. He often said Emily had renewed his faith in justice. "Emily taught me that the truth always comes out, even if it takes time," he said. "And sometimes it comes from the most unlikely people." Sandra Johnson, the former secretary who had kept the evidence safe for years, also became an anti-fraud activist. She created an organization to help others who had fallen victim to similar schemes. "Emily gave me the courage to do what was right," Sandra would say. "If she had the bravery to take on the entire justice system, I had to find the courage to tell the truth." The case involving Dorothy and Emily also led to the arrest of several others involved in Richard's scheme. Richard himself was finally tracked down in another state, where he was running the same scam on other small business owners. When arrested, Richard tried to deny everything, but the evidence gathered by Emily and the lawyers was irrefutable. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison for aggravated fraud and criminal conspiracy. During Richard's trial, Emily was called to testify again. Now 12 years old, she faced the man who had destroyed her grandmother's life with remarkable composure. "Why did you do this to my grandmother?" Emily asked Richard directly. "She trusted you." Richard couldn't answer. He lowered his head, clearly shaken by the girl's courage in confronting him. Dorothy, who was present in the courtroom, felt a mix of sadness and pride. Sadness for having been deceived by someone she trusted, but immense pride for her granddaughter, who had fought tirelessly for justice. The years that followed brought even more recognition for Emily. She became the youngest speaker on senior rights in the country, receiving invitations to international events. By 15, Emily had already decided she wanted to study law. She received full scholarship offers from several prestigious universities, but chose to attend Cleveland State University to stay close to her grandmother. During high school, she continued volunteering with organizations advocating for senior rights. Her practical experience and theoretical knowledge made her a leading voice on the subject. "Emily, you've already changed more lives than many seasoned lawyers," said Professor Robert, who had become her mentor. "I can hardly imagine what you'll accomplish once you graduate." Dorothy watched with pride as her granddaughter achieved one milestone after another. Her shop had become a local landmark. Beyond selling crafts, she now offered free advice to other small business owners on how to protect themselves from fraud. "My granddaughter taught me that we should never give up on justice," Dorothy would tell visitors to her shop, "and that sometimes the solution comes from the most unexpected places." When Emily turned 18, she was thrown a surprise party organized by the entire community. Guests ranged from neighbors to renowned lawyers, judges, congressmen, and people from across the country who had been inspired by her story. "Emily, you've shown us that age doesn't matter when fighting for what's right," said Judge Charles Allen, who had ruled in Dorothy's favor during a speech at the party. "You're an example to all of us." That same year, Emily began law school. On her first day, she was welcomed like a celebrity by classmates and professors, but she remained humble and focused on her goals. "I'm here to learn and prepare myself to help even more people," Emily said during her class introduction. "My experience has taught me a lot, but I know I still have much to learn." In college, Emily excelled in all her courses, especially criminal law and consumer protection. She participated in several legal clinics, always focusing on cases involving seniors who had been defrauded. Her thesis was on legal protections for seniors against tax fraud, drawing from her own experience and years of study and advocacy in the field. "This thesis is more than just an academic work," said her advisor, Professor Mark Stevens. "It's a practical manual based on real-life experience fighting for justice." When she graduated at 22, Emily already had clear plans. She wanted to open a law firm specializing in defending elderly victims of fraud, free of charge. "Grandma, remember when you said I was just fantasizing as a child?" Emily asked on her graduation day. "Well, now my fantasy has become reality." Dorothy, now 78, cried with emotion, watching her granddaughter receive her diploma. "My dear granddaughter, you turned our tragedy into something beautiful," she said. "How many people will be helped because of what you learned from our story?" Emily's law firm opened 6 months after graduation. She named it Dorothy Wilson Law Firm Social Advocacy. In just the first month, she took on over 50 cases of elderly victims of various types of fraud. "I won't let any family go through what we did," Emily said in an interview on opening day. "Every case I take is a chance to deliver justice." Professor Robert, now 80, joined the firm as a volunteer consultant. Ms. Catherine, the librarian who had helped Emily in the beginning, also became a volunteer, assisting with research. "It's beautiful to see how that 10-year-old girl grew into this extraordinary woman," Ms. Catherine said, "and even more beautiful that she never forgot where she came from." The firm became a national leader in elder protection. Emily developed her own methodology to identify fraud patterns and created educational booklets to teach seniors how to protect themselves. 5 years after opening, Emily had helped over 1,000 families. Her team had grown to include lawyers, social workers, psychologists, and accountants, specializing in fraud cases. "Every client reminds me of my grandmother," Emily would say. "It's like I'm saving her all over again with each case." Dorothy, despite her age, still worked in her shop a few hours a day. She became an informal advisor to other seniors in the area, always guiding them on safeguarding documents and contracts. "Ms. Dorothy, you and your granddaughter have saved so many people," said Mr. Martin, who remained their neighbor and friend. "You turned something terrible into something wonderful." Emily and Dorothy's story continued to inspire people across the country. Books, documentaries, and even a mini-series were made about them. But for both, what mattered most was knowing they were making a difference in others' lives. "Sweetheart, when you were little and said you'd get me out of prison, I thought it was just a child's dream," Dorothy said one afternoon as they talked in the shop. "I never imagined you'd do so much more." "Grandma, you taught me never to give up. Everything I've achieved is because I learned from you that fighting for what's right is worth it," Emily replied. By 30, Emily was considered one of the country's most respected lawyers in elder protection. She'd received numerous awards, but what made her proudest was knowing thousands of families had been spared injustices like hers and her grandmother's. The firm had expanded to other cities and states. Emily's methodology was being implemented in universities and consumer protection agencies. "Emily, you've turned your pain into healing for others," said Ms. Fiona, who remained her mentor and friend. "That's what defines a true lawyer." Dorothy, at 85, was still Emily's biggest admirer and advisor. Despite age-related limitations, she remained sharp and proud of the granddaughter who had changed their lives, and so many others. On a special afternoon, when Emily celebrated 15 years as a lawyer, she organized a ceremony at the office to honor all the people who had made her journey possible. It all started with a 10-year-old girl who refused to accept injustice, Emily said in her speech. "Today, 15 years later, I can say that girl wasn't wrong. Justice is always worth it." Professor Robert, Ms. Catherine, Mr. Martin, Sandra Johnson, Ms. Fiona, Patricia from TV, Judge Charles Allen, and dozens of others who had helped were all present. But the seat of honor was Dorothy's, sitting in the front row, smiling proudly. "Grandma, this tribute is all for you," Emily said, helping Dorothy stand up. "Everything I've built was to honor you and prove that your innocence was worth every minute of the fight." The two embraced under the emotional applause of everyone there. It was the perfect picture of how love, determination, and the pursuit of justice can turn tragedies into victories. "My dear granddaughter, Dorothy whispered into Emily's ear. "You didn't just save me. You saved all of us." End of story. And what about you, dear listener? What did you think of this story of determination and justice? Would you have the same courage as Emily to fight for your loved ones? Tell us in the comments which part moved you the most, and if you know any similar stories. Your opinion means a lot to us. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other inspiring stories like this one.